The sound of a gunshot split the air as Keegan Xavier rode into the town of Redemption Springs, Arizona Territory. 1885. Blood seeping through his shirt where the bullet had grazed his shoulder. He wasn't running from the law, he was running from himself, and the memories that chased him across the dusty plains of the West like vengeful spirits. His face, once handsome and open as the Montana sky, had grown hard as the rocky terrain he'd traversed, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. The town was like any other frontier settlement, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a saloon with piano music spilling onto the boardwalk and people who minded their own business. That was just how Keegan liked it. Anonymous. Forgettable. A place where no one knew his name or the blood on his hands. "You need that looked at, mister," said a gruff voice as Keegan dismounted outside the livery stable, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "It's nothing," Keegan muttered, leading his horse, a dappled gray stallion named Ghost, toward the stable entrance. "That nothing is dripping all over my clean straw," the stable master said. "Doc's away, but the schoolteacher knows her way around wounds. Miss Olivia Kennedy." Cabin at the end of Willow Street. Keegan had no intention of seeking help from a schoolteacher, but as he paid for Ghost's boarding and walked toward the saloon, the world began to tilt and sway. The blood loss was worse than he'd thought. He steadied himself against a hitching post, cursing under his breath. Willow Street was a short walk from the main thoroughfare, and the cabin at the end stood apart from the others, with a small garden out front and smoke curling from the chimney. Keegan hesitated at the gate, his pride battling with the growing dizziness. Finally, practicality won out. He couldn't afford to pass out in a strange town. His knuckles had barely touched the door when it swung open, revealing a woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, intelligent hazel eyes, and a book in her hand. She was younger than he expected, perhaps 25, with a dusting of freckles across her nose and a determined set to her chin. "You're bleeding on my porch," she said matter-of-factly. "You're Olivia Kennedy?" Keegan asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I am." "And you're the stranger who rode in with a bullet wound. Come inside before you fall over." She stepped aside, and Keegan found himself following her command without question. The cabin was small but warm, with bookshelves lining one wall and a table covered in paper schoolwork, he presumed. She cleared a space and gestured for him to sit, then gathered supplies from a cabinet. "Shirt off," she instructed, setting a basin of water on the table. Keegan hesitated. "I can manage." "I'm sure you can," she replied, raising an eyebrow, "but it will be faster and more thorough if I help." "I've treated worse wounds than yours, Mr. Xavier, Keegan Xavier." He reluctantly unbuttoned his shirt, grimacing as the dried blood pulled at the wound. "Well, Mr. Xavier, you're fortunate. The bullet only grazed you. Though from the state of this wound, I'd say it happened yesterday, not today." 2 days ago, Keegan admitted. "Haven't had time to stop." Olivia's hands were gentle but firm as she cleaned the wound. "Running from something or toward something?" "Neither," Keegan lied, his jaw tightening. "Most men who ride into town bleeding have a story," she pressed, applying a stinging solution that made him hiss through his teeth. "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed, surprising him with a small smile. "Most men would have complained more by now." As she worked, Keegan found himself studying her. She moved with confidence, her hands steady, her expression focused. She wasn't what he expected in a frontier schoolteacher. There was something in her eyes that spoke of experiences beyond schoolbooks and primers. "What brings a woman like you to a place like this?" he asked, trying to distract himself from the pain. "A woman like me?" she echoed, reaching for bandages. "What sort of woman do you think I am, Mr. Xavier? Educated, Eastern, I'd guess. You could be teaching in a fine school in Boston or Philadelphia." "Perhaps I prefer the West," she said simply. "Hold still now." As she leaned in to wrap the bandage, Keegan caught her scent lavender soap and something uniquely her own. It had been a long time since he'd been this close to a woman who wasn't working in a saloon, and longer still since he'd allowed anyone to care for him. It made him uncomfortable, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with his physical wound. "There," she said, stepping back to survey her work. "Keep it clean and come back in 2 days so I can check it." Keegan stood, reaching for his shirt. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing, but you might tell me the truth about how you got that wound." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Keegan considered telling her everything about the bounty hunter who'd tracked him through 3 territories, about the gunfight at dawn in a nameless town, about the nightmares that plagued him. But old habits died hard. "A disagreement," he said finally, buttoning his shirt. "Must have been quite a disagreement," she observed, crossing her arms. "You have no idea." Keegan reached for his hat. "Thank you for your help, Miss Kennedy." "Mr. Xavier," she called as he reached the door. "Whatever you're running from, it follows you, you know, everywhere you go." He paused, one hand on the doorframe. "Some things you can't outrun," he acknowledged. "You just try to stay a step ahead." Her words followed him as he made his way to the small hotel on the main street, haunting him like a familiar ghost. She was right, of course. The past was always at his heels, no matter how far or fast he rode. Keegan stayed in Redemption Springs for 2 more days, telling himself it was to rest ghost and replenish his supplies. He avoided the schoolhouse and Olivia Kennedy's cabin, despite her instructions to return. On the 3rd morning, as he was preparing to leave, a commotion in the street drew him to the window of his room. A group of men had surrounded a wagon outside the general store. One of them, a burly fellow with an unkempt beard, was shouting at the driver, Olivia Kennedy, her auburn hair gleaming in the morning sun. "That land is spoken for, Miss Kennedy. You best sell it back to Mr. Hargrove before there's trouble." "That land was purchased legally, Mr. Donovan," Olivia replied, her voice carrying clearly. "I have the deed, signed and notarized in Tucson. If Mr. Hargrove has a complaint, he can take it up with the territorial court." "Hargrove don't take kindly to being crossed, especially by a woman," Donovan growled, stepping closer to the wagon. "Might be this town suddenly ain't safe for a lady living alone." Keegan was moving before he'd consciously decided to intervene, strapping on his gun belt and heading down the stairs. By the time he reached the street, the confrontation had escalated, with Donovan's hand resting menacingly on Olivia's wagon wheel. "Is there a problem here?" Keegan asked, his voice deceptively casual as he approached, all eyes turned to him. Donovan's narrowed with suspicion. "Ain't no concern of yours, stranger." "Actually," Keegan said, stepping between Donovan and the wagon, "Miss Kennedy is a friend of mine, so her concerns are my concerns." "Keegan," Olivia said, surprise evident in her voice, "I can handle this." "I'm sure you can," he replied without taking his eyes off Donovan. "But where I come from, gentlemen don't threaten ladies in the street." Donovan sized him up, his gaze lingering on the gun at Keegan's hip and the cold look in his eyes. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider. "Just delivering a message," he muttered, backing away. "Hargrove will hear about this." "I'm counting on it," Olivia called after him, then turned to Keegan. "That was unnecessary." "You're welcome," Keegan replied dryly. "Who's Hargrove and what's this about land?" Olivia sighed, tying the reins of her horse as she climbed down from the wagon. "George Hargrove owns most of the land around Redemption Springs. He thought he owned the parcel where my cabin sits too, but the previous owner sold it to me before Hargrove could claim it. He's been trying to pressure me to sell ever since." "Why is this piece of land so important to him?" "Water rights," she explained, gesturing for him to follow her into the general store. "The creek that runs through my property feeds into the river that waters his cattle range. If he controls my land, he controls who has access to water in the whole valley." Keegan followed her inside, watching as she handed a list to the storekeeper. "And you're holding out against the most powerful man in the territory. It's not just about me," Olivia said, her voice lowering. "There are homesteaders and small ranchers who depend on that water. If Hargrove takes control, he'll run them all out." "That's not your fight," Keegan pointed out. Olivia turned to look at him, her hazel eyes flashing. Not every fight is chosen, Mr. Xavier. Sometimes the fight chooses you. Her words struck something deep within him, echoing his own experiences in ways she couldn't possibly understand. For a moment, they stood looking at each other in the dim light of the store, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "I thought you were leaving town," she said finally. "I am," he confirmed, "just waiting for the stage to bring in some supplies I ordered." "I see." Was that disappointment in her voice? "Well, I appreciate your intervention, unnecessary as it was. Does Hargrove usually send his men to intimidate you in broad daylight?" "No," she admitted, collecting her parcels as the storekeeper filled her order. "That's new. Usually it's just strongly worded letters from his lawyer." "Be careful," Keegan warned. "Men like that don't like to be refused, especially publicly." "I can take care of myself," Olivia insisted, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't doubt it," Keegan said, taking some of the heavier packages from her arms without asking. "But everyone needs help sometimes." They walked back to her wagon in silence, loading the supplies into the back. As they finished, Keegan found himself reluctant to leave. "Your wound," Olivia said suddenly. "You never came back to have it checked." "It's healing fine," he assured her. "You do good work, Miss Kennedy." "Olivia," she corrected him. "I think after you've played the gallant defender, you might as well use my given name." "Olivia," he repeated, liking the way it felt on his tongue, "and I'm Keegan." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Well, Keegan Xavier, since you're still in town, perhaps you join me for supper tonight, as thanks for your intervention." The invitation caught him off guard. It had been years since he'd been invited to a respectable woman's home for a meal. Every instinct told him to refuse, to maintain the distance he always kept between himself and others. But something about Olivia Kennedy made him want to break his own rules. "I'd be honored," he heard himself say. 7 o'clock, she replied, climbing onto the wagon seat. "And don't worry, I won't ask about the bullet wound again." With a flick of the reins, she was off, leaving Keegan standing in the street with an unfamiliar feeling in his chest that might, if he'd been willing to admit it, have been something like anticipation. That evening, Keegan arrived at Olivia's cabin precisely at 7, a bottle of decent whiskey in hand. He'd taken the time to visit the bathhouse and get a shave at the barber's, and had even purchased a new shirt at the general store. He told himself it was simply a matter of respect, but the truth was more complicated. Olivia answered his knock wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders in waves of auburn. The sight of her took his breath away momentarily. "You clean up well," she observed with a smile, taking in his appearance. "As do you," he replied, handing her the whiskey. "Though I imagine you're always this presentable," she laughed, a bright sound in the gathering dusk. "You clearly haven't seen me after a day of teaching 30 children during a dust storm. Come in." The cabin seemed different in the evening light, more intimate. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the table was set for two, with a savory stew bubbling in a pot over the fire. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that made Keegan acutely aware of how long he'd been drifting, without home or hearth to call his own. The evening passed pleasantly, with conversation flowing as easily as the whiskey Olivia poured into 2 glasses. She told him about growing up in Chicago, the daughter of a lawyer and a teacher, and how she'd come west after the death of her parents, seeking a new beginning. "Most people go east for opportunity," Keegan observed, savoring the stew, which was surprisingly good. "I'm not most people," she replied with a smile. "There's something about the West, the openness, the possibility. A person can reinvent themselves here." "Is that what you're doing, reinventing yourself, in a way?" she admitted. "In Chicago, I was always someone's daughter, someone's student, someone's potential wife. Here, I'm just Olivia." Keegan understood that sentiment all too well. "Freedom has its price, though." "Loneliness," she agreed, her eyes meeting his across the table. But I've found that loneliness exists everywhere, even in crowded cities. And have you found what you were looking for in Redemption Springs? He asked. She considered the question, twirling her glass between her fingers. I've found purpose. The children need education and the land dispute well, that gives me something to fight for, but there are still empty spaces. The vulnerability in her admission touched something in Keegan, made him want to offer some truth of his own. I understand empty spaces, he said quietly. Your turn, Olivia said, leaning forward. What brings Keegan Xavier to the Arizona territory with a bullet wound and shadows in his eyes? For a moment, he considered his usual deflection, but the whiskey and the warmth of the fire and the genuine interest in her eyes loosened his tongue. I was a lawman once, he began, surprising himself with the admission. Marshal in a town in Colorado, it was a good life until it wasn't. What happened? She asked gently. Keegan stared into his glass. I trusted the wrong man. My deputy, a man I'd ridden with for 3 years, shared meals with, thought I knew. Turned out he was in league with a gang of bank robbers. They hit the town bank, killed 3 people. When I went to confront him, he was waiting for me. The bullet wound, Olivia guessed. No, Keegan said, his voice hardening. That one healed years ago. He shot me, left me for dead. When I recovered, I went after him and the gang, tracked them for months. Did you find them? I found them, Keegan confirmed, the memory of that bloody day etched into his mind. In a town called Bitter Creek, there was a shootout. 4 men died, including my former deputy. And you've been running ever since, Olivia said softly. It wasn't a question, not running, Keegan corrected. Drifting. I turned in my badge after Bitter Creek. Couldn't wear the star anymore, not after what happened. Because of what you did to those men. Because I couldn't see the betrayal coming, Keegan admitted. A lawman who's that blind is a danger to everyone around him. Olivia was quiet for a moment, considering his words. We all have blind spots when it comes to those we care about, she said finally. That's human, not a failing. In my line of work, human failings get people killed. And what's your line of work now? Keegan hesitated. Odd jobs, some hunting, occasional security for stagecoach runs. A drifter with a gun, she translated. Running from your reflection. The accuracy of her assessment struck him like a physical blow. You see a lot, Miss Kennedy. Olivia, she reminded him. And yes, I do. It's a teacher's job to observe, to understand what's not being said. Their eyes met across the table, and Keegan felt exposed in a way he hadn't in years. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a clear-eyed understanding that was somehow more unsettling than condemnation would have been. It's getting late, he said, rising from the table. Thank you for the meal and the company. Olivia stood as well, moving to walk him to the door. Thank you for sharing your story. Not many men would. Not much of a story, Keegan demurred. I disagree, she said, stopping at the threshold. It's a story about a man who believed in justice enough to pursue it, even at great personal cost. Or a man too stubborn to let go of vengeance, Keegan countered. Perhaps both, Olivia acknowledged. We're all contradictions, Keegan Xavier. In the doorway, with the night air cool around them and the lamplight casting her features in soft gold, Olivia seemed both strong and vulnerable, a paradox that drew him inexorably toward her. Without thinking, he leaned down and brushed his lips against hers, a gentle kiss that surprised them both. Olivia's eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she lifted a hand to his cheek, her touch light as a whisper. Be careful, she murmured. I might start to think you're planning to stay in Redemption Springs. I'm leaving on tomorrow's stage, Keegan reminded her, though the words no longer felt as certain as they had that morning. Of course, she said, stepping back. Safe travels then. As he walked back to the hotel under a canopy of stars, Keegan found himself questioning the decision that had seemed so clear just hours earlier. The stage would leave at noon, carrying him away from Redemption Springs and Olivia Kennedy. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice for a man with his past. But for the first time in years, the thought of moving on brought no relief, only a hollow ache in his chest, Morning brought a clear sky and a decision. Keegan packed his few belongings and settled his bill at the hotel, then made his way to the stagecoach office to purchase a ticket. The stage was due at noon, giving him time for one last visit to the livery to check on Ghost, who would be transported separately to the next major town. As he approached the stable, the sound of raised voices reached him. Turning the corner, he saw Olivia Kennedy standing before her wagon, confronting 3 men Donovan from the previous day and 2 others he didn't recognize. "This is your final warning, Miss Kennedy," one of the men was saying, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered gun. "Mr. Hargrove wants you gone by sundown." "Or what, Mr. Ellis?" Olivia challenged, her chin raised defiantly though Keegan could see the tension in her shoulders. "Will you burn me out like you did the Sanderson family? Or perhaps just shoot me and claim it was an accident like poor Mr. Chen?" Ellis's face darkened with rage. "You've got a smart mouth, lady, might get you in trouble." "It already has," Olivia replied coolly. "Now get off my property." Ellis took a menacing step forward and Keegan moved without hesitation, his hand dropping to his gun as he strode toward the confrontation. "The lady asked you to leave," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, all heads turned toward him. Ellis's eyes narrowed. "This ain't your business, stranger." "I'm making it my business," Keegan replied, coming to stand beside Olivia. He could feel her surprise at his appearance, but she didn't comment. "You're outnumbered," Donovan pointed out, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "Am I?" Keegan asked mildly. His reputation as a marksman had once been legendary in Colorado, and though years had passed, his skill hadn't diminished. Something in his stance or expression must have communicated this, because the third man, who had remained silent until now, put a restraining hand on Ellis's arm. "Let's go, Frank," he murmured. Hargrove said to warn her not start a gunfight in the middle of town. Ellis hesitated, clearly torn between backing down and escalating the confrontation. Finally, he spat on the ground at Olivia's feet. "This ain't over, Miss Kennedy. And your guard dog won't always be around." The 3 men mounted their horses and rode off, leaving Keegan and Olivia standing in their dust. "I thought you were leaving today," Olivia said, turning to face him. "I am," Keegan confirmed. "Stage leaves at noon." "Then why are you here?" There was genuine confusion in her voice, and something else of vulnerability that tugged at him. "I wanted to say goodbye properly," he said. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. "Well, your timing was fortunate," Olivia acknowledged, glancing in the direction Ellis and his men had gone. "Though I could have handled them." "I know you could," Keegan said, and meant it. There was a steel in Olivia Kennedy that many men lacked, but you shouldn't have to, not alone. "Are you volunteering to stay and help?" There was a challenge in her voice, as if she were daring him to contradict his earlier plans. "I can't," Keegan said, regret coloring his voice. "I'm not the man you need, Olivia. My presence here would only bring more trouble." "I think I can decide for myself what kind of man I need," she replied, her hazel eyes meeting his directly. "And you don't strike me as someone who runs from trouble, Keegan Xavier, only from yourself." Her words hit home with uncomfortable accuracy. Keegan ran a hand through his hair, frustration building within him. "What do you want from me, Olivia? I'm a drifter with a target on my back. The man who shot me 2 days ago wasn't the first to come after me, and he won't be the last." "I want you to stop hiding," she said simply. "I want you to look at yourself and see what I see." "And what's that?" he asked, almost afraid of the answer, a man worth knowing. "Worth," she broke off, color rising in her cheeks. "Worth what?" Keegan pressed, stepping closer. "Worth loving," Olivia finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung between them, honest and terrifying in their implication. Keegan felt his carefully constructed defenses crumbling in the face of her directness. "You don't know me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know enough," Olivia countered. "I know you're honorable. I know you protect those who need protecting. I know you carry wounds that haven't healed. And I know that when you kissed me last night, it wasn't just a goodbye." She was right, and they both knew it. The kiss had been a beginning, not an ending, a door opening to possibilities Keegan had long denied himself. "I have to go," he said, taking a step back. "The stage, go then," Olivia said, disappointment evident in her expression. "But remember what I said, Keegan. I see more in you than you know." With those words echoing in his mind, Keegan turned and walked away, each step harder than the last. By the time he reached the stage coach office, his resolve was wavering. The ticket in his pocket felt like a leaden weight, a symbol of the life he'd chosen for himself, always moving, never connecting, never belonging. As noon approached, Keegan found himself standing outside the town's only barber shop, staring at his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was a stranger, hollow-eyed and grim, the lines of his face etched by years of solitude and vigilance. Was this what Olivia saw when she looked at him? Or did she truly see something more, something he had lost sight of long ago? The distant sound of horses and the rumble of wagon wheels announced the arrival of the stagecoach. Decision time. Keegan's hand moved to his pocket, feeling the outline of the ticket. The smart choice was to get on that stage, to continue the life he knew, to protect Olivia from the dangers that followed him. But as he turned toward the coach, a commotion from the direction of Olivia's cabin caught his attention. Smoke was rising in a thick plume, and even from this distance, he could hear shouts and the crack of gunfire. Keegan didn't hesitate. The ticket fell forgotten to the ground as he ran toward the livery, calling for Ghost to be saddled. Within minutes, he was galloping toward Olivia's property, his gun drawn and his heart pounding with fear and rage. The scene that greeted him was one of chaos. Olivia's cabin was ablaze, flames leaping from the roof and windows. Ellis, Donovan, and several other men were ransacking the outbuildings while Olivia herself stood in the yard, a rifle in her hands, firing at her attackers from behind the cover of the well. Keegan dismounted at the edge of the property and approached on foot, using the trees for cover. Ellis was shouting orders, directing his men to circle around behind Olivia's position. They hadn't noticed Keegan's arrival yet, giving him the advantage of surprise. He took aim and fired, the bullet striking the ground at Ellis's feet. The man jumped back with a curse, spinning to locate the source of the shot. "That was a warning," Keegan called, moving from tree to tree to conceal his position. "The next one won't be, Xavier," Ellis snarled. "Should have known you'd show up. This ain't your fight." "You made it my fight when you attacked a woman on her own property," Keegan replied, edging closer. "Drop your weapons and leave, all of you, now." "There's 6 of us and 1 of you," Ellis countered, "and Hargrove wants this land." "Then Hargrove should come and take it himself, not send cowards to burn out a schoolteacher," Keegan said, his voice carrying across the yard. He had positioned himself where he could see Olivia, who was still crouched behind the well. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a subtle nod, indicating for her to be ready. Ellis barked a laugh. "Hargrove don't get his hands dirty, that's what he pays us for." "Last chance," Keegan warned. "Leave now or this gets ugly." For answer, Ellis raised his gun and fired in Keegan's direction, the bullet splintering the tree trunk beside his head. The other men followed suit, and suddenly the air was filled with the sound of gunfire. Keegan returned fire with deadly precision, dropping one of Ellis's men with a shot to the shoulder. Olivia, seeing her opportunity, emerged from behind the well and fired her rifle, the bullet grazing Donovan's leg and sending him stumbling for cover. The tide of the battle shifted quickly. These men might be bullies, but they weren't gunfighters. When another of their number fell with a bullet in his thigh courtesy of Keegan's accurate shooting, their resolve began to waver. "This ain't worth dying for," one of them shouted, backing toward his horse. Ellis, seeing his men's courage faltering, made a desperate move. He lunged toward Olivia, clearly intending to use her as a shield or hostage. But Keegan had anticipated this, and his bullet caught Ellis in the arm before he could reach her, sending his gun spinning to the ground. "It's over, Ellis," Keegan said, emerging from the trees, his gun still trained on the wounded man. "Get your men and go. Tell Hargrove if he wants this land, he'll have to go through me to get it. Blood seeping through his sleeve, Ellis glared at Keegan with undisguised hatred. You're a dead man, Xavier. You and the schoolteacher both. Maybe, Keegan acknowledged, but not today. Ellis spat on the ground, then gestured to his remaining men. Let's go, help Thompson and Carter onto their horses. As Ellis and his men retreated, Keegan hurried to Olivia's side. She was unharmed, though her face was smudged with soot and her hands were trembling slightly from the adrenaline of the fight. Are you all right? He asked, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. I'm fine, she assured him, leaning her rifle against the well. But my home. They both turned to look at the cabin, now fully engulfed in flames. There would be no saving it. The structure was already collapsing in on itself, years of Olivia's life turning to ash before their eyes. I'm sorry, Keegan said, knowing the words were inadequate. It's just a building, Olivia replied, though her voice caught. The important thing's the deed to the land, my mother's locket. A few books I managed to save those when I saw them coming. Keegan's admiration for her resilience grew. You're an extraordinary woman, Olivia Kennedy. And you, she said, turning to face him fully, are not on that stage, coach. No, he agreed. I'm exactly where I need to be. The admission seemed to cost him something, a final surrender of the barriers he'd maintained for so long. Olivia must have seen this in his face because she stepped closer, her hand coming to rest on his chest above his heart. You saw your reflection today, didn't you? She asked softly. In the barber shop window, I saw you standing there before I came home. Keegan nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening his throat. And what did you see? Olivia pressed. A man I didn't recognize anymore, Keegan admitted. A man who's been running so long he's forgotten what he's running from. And now? Now, Keegan said, covering her hand with his own, I see a man who's tired of running, a man who wants to stay if you'll have him. Olivia's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. I told you I see more than you know, she said, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss deepened, a promise and a beginning. When they finally parted, Keegan rested his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her, feeling for the first time in years the sense that he was where he belonged. We should go into town, he said reluctantly. Report what happened. Find you a place to stay until we can rebuild. We, Olivia questioned, a teasing light in her eyes. We, Keegan confirmed. I may not know much about building houses, but I'm a quick learner and I'm not going anywhere, not anymore. What about your past, the men who are after you? Keegan looked toward the horizon where Ellis and his men had disappeared. Some fights choose you, he said, echoing her words from days before, and some enemies you face together. Olivia squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes. Together, then. Though I think our first order of business should be dealing with Hargrove. Agreed, but legally, through the territorial courts, I'm done with gunfights if I can help it. As they walked toward their horses, Olivia cast one last look at the smoldering remains of her cabin. You know, she said thoughtfully, when we rebuild we should make it bigger. Room for a family, perhaps. The casual suggestion of a future together sent a surge of warmth through Keegan's chest. A family, he repeated, testing the word like a man trying on new clothing. I'd like that. So would I, Olivia said, smiling up at him. But first, we have a land dispute to settle and a town to scandalize with our unmarried living arrangements. Keegan laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. We could always solve the second problem rather quickly. I hear the circuit judge passes through town next week. Olivia's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with emotion. Is that a proposal, Keegan Xavier? It's a beginning, he replied, lifting her hand to his lips. The beginning of a story I never thought I'd have. The best stories, Olivia said, leaning into his side as they mounted their horses, are the ones we don't see coming. As they rode toward town side by side, Keegan felt the weight of years of solitude lifting from his shoulders. In Olivia's eyes, he had found not just acceptance but understanding, not just forgiveness but redemption. She had seen in him what he could no longer see in himself, the possibility of a future, of love, of home. The road ahead would not be easy. Hargrove would fight for the land, and the shadows of Keegan's past might still find him. But for the first time since that bloody day in Bitter Creek, Keegan Xavier was no longer running. He was standing his ground, beside a woman who saw him clearly and loved him anyway, in a place that might, with time and effort, become the home he had never allowed himself to hope for. And that, he realized as they crested the hill overlooking Redemption Springs, was worth fighting for.